So we're on page 173, and we're looking at session 10. We're moving into the New Testament. We're looking at the life of Christ. And remember, when we talked about our Old Testament, we had 17 books of narrative, 5 books of poetry, and then we have 17 books of prophecy. And look how far we've made it. You should be remembering your Panorama timeline. Here are the 9 movements so far in the Panorama timeline, working from prologue all the way to return from exile. That's Old Testament. That's the Hebrew Bible. As we turn the page to page 174, we now look at the New Testament. And we should have written this already in your table of contents way back in the very first day, but we have 5 narratives in our New Testament. The 4 Gospels, and then Luke and the book of Acts they're a 2-volume work written by the Gospel writer Luke. He wrote both Luke and Acts. So that's the 5 books of narrative. Then we have 21 epistolary. Now we've said before, theologians love to use a big word when a small word would do. 21 letters. That's what we mean by epistolary. That just means letters. 13 letters of Paul and 8 general letters, which just means by different authors. And then we have 1 book of prophecy in our New Testament. Now, when we talk about the Gospels, we're going to spend a little bit of time and we're going to come back to this. But first, let's get our timeline for this section, this movement, the life of Christ. To do that, turn the page to page 176. We're going to come back to the Gospels in just a moment. But here's our timeline so we can follow our same pattern. Here's where we're at. The timeline for the life of Christ will begin with the birth of Jesus. We will then have a period of obscurity, which is essentially a way of saying we don't have a detailed account of this particular part of his ministry and life. Then we will have, and I always do it with my hand, rising popularity, then increasing opposition, which will lead to the Passion Week, the death of Jesus, and then we're going to add to our timeline. I know it's not printed for you on 176. The death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus and the ascension of Jesus. So here's the life of Christ. Birth, obscurity, rising popularity as the crowds are drawn to him, increasing opposition as the things that he is saying, the way that he is redefining the nature of the answer to Israel's problem and the coming kingdom, the way that he is redefining that around himself, the Jewish leadership will reject wholeheartedly, and then he will face that increasing opposition, which will lead to Passion Week, his betrayal, arrest, and trials leading to his crucifixion and death, which will then be the power of his resurrection will be the sign that sin and death have been defeated, and we'll see that in his resurrection, ascension, and that's the life of Jesus. Now, a couple of notes before we move to talk about the Gospels. Notice, we place the birth of Jesus anywhere from 6 to 4 BC, and I don't want that to freak anybody out. A lot of us assume that Jesus was born in year 0 and died in 33, and that's okay, but we're a little bit off at our dating. The way that we even date our chronology, we right now are in the year 2020, which means in the year of our Lord, 2020 AD, year of our Lord. And the Middle Ages monk that gave us the dating and the timing of the birth of Jesus, it was before the Middle Ages, but when we dated our calendar back to the birth of Jesus, he was actually off by about 5 years. How do we know that? The birth of Jesus took place when Herod the Great was we might say the local governor of Judea, and we are pretty confident in the death of Herod in 4 BC. So Jesus was born almost certainly before 4 BC, probably in the winter of 6 or 5 BC. And there's a couple of options, a couple of available options on the death of Jesus. Some scholars put the death of Jesus in 30 AD, others in 33. I prefer the 33 AD for the death of Jesus, which means Jesus was about 37 years old when he was crucified and killed. And Luke tells us, the gospel writer Luke tells us that Jesus was about 30 when he began his ministry, and that probably means he was about 33 when he began his public ministry. And so we say all the time, Jesus lived 33 years on earth, 33 years on earth, and that's true if he died in 30. It was about 33 or 4 years. If he died in 33 and was born in 5 or 6, then he was about 37 or 38 years old. And no big deal if you keep saying 33, not the end of the world. But we want to look historically. The Bible is not mythology. The Bible is not talking about itself as a fable or myth. The Bible places itself in real history and says, go investigate. And I love that. We can go look with confidence at the historicity of these events as the Bible portrays them. And so there's our timeline: birth, obscurity, rising popularity, increasing opposition, Passion Week, death, resurrection, and ascension. That's the life of Christ. Now let's look at what is a gospel and how do the gospels fit together.